Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Rita Carroll from Australia, who tells me, well, I know that she's currently chaplain at Stuart Home in Australia. And she gave me a few facts about herself. She's a scientist and has also taught RE. But I was surprised to see that history wasn't a subject among the ones that she told me about, because the first time I met Rita was in chapter 2000, when she and I, with Joan Pender and Jane Maltby, went on a tour of the war cemeteries near Amiens, where the chapter was being held in northern France. And I got to know her there as somebody with a passion for history and for things Australian. And she also tells me she's from very particular Australian aristocracy. And so the passion for history is in her bones, and particularly passion for Australian history. And that's wonderful for us, because it means she's going to talk to us about Janet Stewart's time in Australia and her connections there. But perhaps for even more interest for me is her knowledge of Richard Stuart, Janet's brother, who lived in Australia for many, many years, and is the brother that Janet called my wild man of the woods. So that's very exciting, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Rita.
Well, I don't think I'll have any scandal to tell you, as Sue had, but this could probably be called a bit about Richard, more of a ripping yarn, I think. As a little nod to Japan, some years ago when Sister Yayoi Hayami came to Australia, she gave some talks on Japanese spirituality, and she told us that Westerners when they listen to bells, they generally listen to the sound of the clapper striking the bell, while the Japanese listen to the echo. And I found myself reflecting on echoes ever since Yayoi introduced me to the idea. So in preparing this talk, I thought of it as listening to the echoes of Two Stuarts in Australia. It's not surprising to find that Richard, as an older half-brother of Janet, shared a number of characteristics in common with her, in spite of their age difference, as they grew up in the same environment and received a similar education. Both are described as delightful personalities. Richard's cheery good humour and open-handed generous nature commended him to many of his friends, while another writer describes Janet as being so affectionate and loving, so thoughtful and helpful, so full of fun and merriment that no one could resist her. It's clear from Janet's letters and writings on education that she had outstanding powers of observation. I think Richard shows a similar capacity through his sketches. Janet's reflections on education always looked to the future. The work in our schools was to lay a foundation for life. Richard, too, had a sense of building for the future in a young colony. Both were fearless spirits, as illustrated by their risky adventures on horseback. Father Galway said to Janet, "I fear you are too rash on horseback. It would not at all be a proper finale for you to die hunting. If the savages were to kill and eat you as a Christian, I should not mind. But I do ambition for you some fate better than a huntress with broken bones." Stories of Richard's adventures, exploits on horseback are legend. It is said that he could do anything with stock, especially horses, ride on the flat or over jumps, and the handling of ribbons he had reduced to a science. The two siblings, with so many characteristics in common, took very different pathways in life. Given his adventurous spirit, it's not surprising that Richard had set off for Australia in 1862, when Janet was 5 years old. So I like to think that she was conscious of Australia from an early age, as no doubt the family had news from him from time to time. Richard's first job was at Burrendown Station on the edge of the Bunya Mountains, and he did a sketch of it, and this is what it looks like. A bit of a contrast from the rectory we were looking at. This is an area I'm very familiar with. It's on the edge of the Bunya Mountains, as it's not far from my hometown of Kingaroy. And my family owned a property in the foothills of the Bunyas. So we've got, could have the next slide. This is Bundooma Station. Richard actually went through this, and my grandfather came up from New South Wales later than Richard to manage this property. So you can see it's built with slabs, and that's cut with an adze. There wasn't any mills to saw it beautifully. This is some of the cattle yards at Bundooma, so you could get a feel for what Richard was in among. This is the post office at Bundooma Station with my grandfather on the right, and this is as it is today. And this is the sort of thing that Richard would have found as he moved away from the homestead, and the sort of people he would have been working with. This is another bush hut. I think this is a little bit later because it's in corrugated iron. And this is the Bunya Mountains country, so you can't imagine green hedges and flat fields. So it was here Mr. David Parry Oakton was the manager of Burrendown, and he had a son called William, with whom Richard formed a lasting friendship, to the extent that they were nicknamed the Inseparables. And there we have them. And there are Parry Oaktons and Lairds still around the Kingaroy district. William, like Richard, had a good education. He was a colonial, as his parents had encouraged his literary bent, and he is described as resourceful, imaginative, and physically strong. He is also recorded as studying Aboriginal law and legend and language, and attended the Feast of the Ripe Bunya Nuts, for which the local tribes gathered. So no doubt Richard learnt a lot from his colonial friend over the years. Records indicate that Richard arrived at a very busy time, so it was during the handling the sheep, and he dived into this with great enthusiasm. So I don't want you to imagine a few sheep scattered over a paddock. Somewhere I forgot to document it, but it was recorded that Burrendown Station had 60,000 sheep. So the sheep shearing time would have been pretty busy. He worked there for a few years and was able to join his friend William Parry Oakton on an exploratory expedition in search for new land. And here I need to point out that there is another perspective on this search for new land, that of the Aboriginal people, whose stories of suffering are only now being told as our nation seeks a path towards reconciliation. We have moved from regarding Australia as terra nullius to restoring the land rights for the Aboriginal people, so that would take a whole other paper. But continuing the story of Richard, the two young men hunted wild horses in the Bunyas, riding down the steep hills like the man from Snowy River. So we could have, I've got a little snippet that I hope will turn up.
Sent the flintstones flying when the pony kept his feet. He cleared the fallen timber in his stride, and the man from Snowy River never shifted in his seat. It was grand to see that mountain horseman ride. Through the stream marks and saplings on the rough and broken ground, down the hillside at a racing pace he went, and he never drew the bridle till he landed safe and sound at the bottom of that terrible descent.
And I can assure you that the Bunyas are just as steep as that, and even my brother is prepared to verify that. So they wrote ballads of their exploits, and the chorus of one attributed to Richard and published in the newspaper goes like this: "Hold tight, all right, now follow your nose right down the mountainside. Look there, see where the wild mob goes. Hurrah for a glorious ride." Having gained the necessary bush skills, Richard was ready to strike out on his own account. So in 1867, in partnership with David Parry Oakton, that's the father, he bought a property, Mount Debatable near Gayndah. Here they introduced a few English customs, as William became the founding master of the Burnett Hunt Club. And you can see the unfortunate kangaroo over there to the side. And they hunted them in full pink. In the various newspapers, it's possible to track something of life on Mount Debatable Station. We have William and Richard getting into a bit of strife for what today we would call road rage, when a water cart crossing the road cramped the style of William's progress in his dog cart. At the Sydney markets in May 1871, it is recorded that 5,000 sheep and 250 head of cattle were sold at satisfactory prices. And we're talking of driving 5,000 sheep, 250 cattle, well over 1,000 miles, over stock roads through all sorts of bushland. One has to just admire them. On a personal level, things were going well for Richard. On the 17th of May 1872, he married Jeanie Miriam McDermott of Gayfield, Ireland, late of Sydney. It is around this time that he purchases Mitchell Downs in partnership with Mr. Gardner. And there you can see Mitchell Downs is 903 square miles. So he probably outclassed some of the Irish relatives with all their estates. In August of the same year, he's appointed magistrate, and it's not surprising there wouldn't have been too many educated people around. And a few years later, in 1875, we read of an inquiry being held into the death of William Hoyle in the presence of Richard Wingfield Stuart, Esquire, J.P. And he finds that Mr. Hoyle died of, excuse me, well, I'll get this in. He died of exhaustion following want of food and water, so he's obviously lost in the bush. Another newspaper records that Mrs. Stewart held a picnic for the Sunday school students that she'd been teaching for a year, and it gushingly adds that the young folk are justly proud that a lady of such position and accomplishments is taking an interest in the moral training of the rising generation. So Richard's vision of what was possible in the colony began to expand, and he dreamt of forming a huge pastoral company which would make great profits for the participants. And so he sold Mitchell Downs and formed the Western Queensland Pastoral Company. He bought Buckingham Downs, a good property that lacked sufficient supply of water. That's not quite so foolish because there is underground water. When he realised that he did not have the resources to develop the property alone, he interested others in the venture. He enlisted a group and formed the Queensland Cooperative Pastoral Company, and then returned to England and recruited a number of influential investors. However, at this time, one of the droughts that we Australians are so familiar with gripped the country, and there's a tragic description in the newspaper. From Roma to Dolvadilla, there are wide stretches of arid plain or bare scrub, and not a living beast can be seen. Occasionally, a disconsolate kangaroo or a lame emu may be seen from afar, and they almost seem to be pleading to be put out of their misery by sudden death. And those sorts of things, they erode the mind, and they go on for 10 years. Low prices and overcapitalisation ruined the venture, and after a few years of struggling, the company went into liquidation. During the final years of his pastoral company, Richard bought a property in Brisbane called Jollymont, which he renamed Stuart Home. It is now the home of our school. Richard sold it when he became bankrupt, and this was the end of Richard's career as a pastoralist. However, a visionary like Richard was not to be deterred, so now he turned his attention to mining. His obituary sums up this part of his life as follows. Mining, of all the fields of investments, the most dangerous to a man of Richard's ardently sanguine temperament. The extreme self-confidence already mentioned added to the peril by deluding him into regarding himself as an expert. Lured by the find of gold, he settled in Tenterfield and was involved in the Volcanic Mineral Company. I haven't got a picture of the town, but that's the sort of country. In 1889, his wife died, and a couple of years later, he remarried, and his second wife, Isabel Clare Lee, was the daughter of a politician, and she became the mother of his 2 sons. Richard had a reputation as a sketcher, and while he was in Tenterfield, he interested himself in art. The local agricultural shows were places where people could exhibit livestock and produce, as well as display skills of various kinds, such as cooking, sewing, and art. Richard participated in these and encouraged others. This would have formed the beginning of Australia's artist communities. His sketchbooks have found a place in our National Library and are a record of those pioneering days. The venture in Tenterfield failed, and nothing daunted, Richard joined the gold rush to Western Australia. For a while his business flourished and then failed when people migrated to Coolgardie, and that's a picture of a mining town at that time, and he was reduced to selling fish. However, fortune smiled again with the floating of the Conrad mine at Inverell, that's back near Tenterfield, so he probably had a few shares there, and he was able to buy a house in Sydney. The lure of minerals attracted him again, and when he heard about a tin mine in Tasmania, having visited the site, he returned to England to raise funds. He never returned to Australia, as he died there on the 8th of January 1914. That's the same year as Janet. One of Richard's obituaries ends with a testament to his wife, Isabel. To this lady, whose courage under all chances of fortune was equal to her husband's, cheerfully sharing his hardships and sustaining his buoyant spirit with tender devotion, a deep sympathy of all who knew and loved him will be given in full measure. Richard, with all the charm of the Stuart clan, needed a whole continent as the backdrop for his enthusiasm. And there we see where he travelled. Some of his paintings indicate he was in New Zealand at some time and in the States. While his friends loved him and at first found his enthusiasm most seductive, constant disillusionment warned them that he was too visionary to be a leader. He is described as gullible for his firm belief in spiritualism, with an incurable habit of credulity. It is not surprising that he died a firm adherent of Christian Science. The last word should come from his own pen. On his deathbed, he was able to write to a friend, and I'm not sure if that was the inseparable. Only a few lines to say that I'm learning what pain is. Had no idea it could be so bad. Am not improving so far as the body goes, but am improving as far as the spirit goes. For my faith in the future is not shaken one iota. If well enough, we'll send a line next mail. Love to all, and God bless you, from your old mate, Dick Stewart. So what a contrast to his sister Janet, whose disciplined life honed similar gifts to become a woman whose visionary leadership was echoed around the globe and down the years. Janet entered the Society in 1882, the same year as the little group of 5 sisters set off from Roehampton to Australia. It does not take much imagination for the older ones of us here, who either went to Sacred Heart schools or entered the Society, to know with what interest letters from Sydney would have been read at recreations. No doubt these accounts held a special interest for Janet, since she had a brother there. In 1892, Janet was named Mistress of Novices, and 2 years later, Superior of Roehampton, where she had a profound influence on the early Australians who made their novitiate there. Claire Percy Dove, who was my junior mistress, records in her memories of her time in England, "My first glimpse of Reverend Mother Stuart was in January 1909, the day I arrived at Roehampton alone, after the long, lonely journey from Australia. She came to the parlour to meet me." This simple phrase belies the profound influence Janet was to have on Claire and the other Australians fortunate to come under her influence. To quote Claire, "Roehampton, when I entered, was, I think, at one of the pinnacles of its achievement. In its details, though not in its principles, the type of formation described by Reverend Mother Stuart no longer suits our time." It is because Janet had such a capacity for keen observation of people and the ability to articulate principles so clearly that we are still able to draw on her wisdom today as we face the challenges of a rapidly changing world. As Janet took up the role of Mother General, it was not something that she plunged into with the wild enthusiasm of her brother. In one of her first letters as Mother General, she wrote, "God, who has so loved and protected the Society in the past, will not abandon it now at this moment of crisis, the crisis of which our venerated Mother Digby spoke so often. when all those who knew the foundress, have heard her teaching and treasured her examples, have passed away. Up to this time, our Mothers General have all personally and even intimately known our Blessed Mother. This direct contact with the foundress, prolonged far beyond what could have been expected, has strengthened the foundations of our religious life. But trial will come. May we prove unshakable and faithful. I think that we're at the same moment when perhaps some of our lay colleagues won't have met RSCJ. Clearly, she was conscious of a moment of change in the society. She was the first person to take up leadership of the society who had not personally met Sophie. Her reaction to this was to take stock by visiting all the houses that she had not seen. So her readiness to take risks and to be open to adventures found expression in a plan to visit all the houses of the society. On her journey to Australia, she wrote her little book of the sea, The Society of the Sacred Heart. Janet herself thought that a true picture, though a fleeting one, may be given of it as it stands today, thankful for the past and hopeful for the future, striving in the present to realise the purpose for which it had come into being. It's interesting to note that this is somewhat like the purpose of the recent gathering of the formation team in Mexico, where they wanted to draw together the fundamental elements which we hold in common in our formation in the society, taking into account our diverse context to support the implementation of these elements so that they become incarnated in our lives. So with these thoughts in mind, Janet came to Oceania and the Vicariate of Timaru. The houses listed in the catalogue were Clifton and Burke Road in Melbourne. I've got a couple of images here, so if we could just click on, that's the geography. You can see the area she was coming to. So this is Melbourne, a picture about the time, so she probably drove down the streets like this. Then to the house of Clifton, which we no longer have. That's the first image I've seen of it. And that one was closed so Stuart Home could be opened. And this is Sacré-Cœur, as it was in Janet's day. This is Sydney Harbour she would have looked out on from Rose Bay. Rose Bay, she would have seen it. Then Auckland, that's Kincoppel in Sydney. And Auckland, as she would have seen it. And Barradine, Remuera, as it was known in those days. She thought it was as beautiful as people said it was. Island Bay in Wellington. That house we no longer own. And this is the town of Timaru in the South Island, with the building they built which no longer is there. And what remains is the sisters in the general cemetery and that cross on the property saying that RSCJ had been there. So that's what Janet would have seen. Japan was also part of the same vicariate with two houses, one in Tokyo and the other in Kobe. According to the catalogue for the year, there were 175 religious in the vicariate. At the invitation of Archbishop Dewick, who hoped that the society would open a school there, she visited Brisbane, and that's Archbishop Dewick in his youth. He died about 1960-something. He was 60 years a bishop. This is where he actually scratched the church out of the bush. His life is fascinating. That's a little country church to contrast with what we've seen at Cottesmore, and those are scattered all over Australia. They could be Uniting Church, Lutheran, Catholic, Anglican, and that's where people used to go to Mass on Sunday. That's my mother on the right-hand side. That's a little house in the country. That's where our boarders would have come from, situations like that, where the priest arrived for Mass with his pack horse, putting stones in his mouth so he didn't have to drink water, and as soon as he arrived he said Mass, then he got his cup of tea. So that's where the students would have come from in Janet's day. When she visited Brisbane, she was taken to see the property at Stuart Home. Now I have to put in a bit of Brisbane because she saw it, where she discovered for the first time that Richard had owned the property. And Janet left our part of the world to visit Japan, so we could have a couple more of Brisbane. That was one of the main streets. That's a Brisbane house, an old Queenslander style as they call it, and the milkman. Visits to each of the houses had a similar pattern. In both Australia and New Zealand, the houses were decorated with native flowers, and where possible, the children brought in some of the native fauna to show off as well. On arrival, Reverend Mother Stewart was met by the community at the entrance of the house, where she greeted each one briefly before she proceeded to the chapel for the Magnificat. Afterwards, they went to the community room for a formal welcome, where one of the community explained what the spiritual practices they had undertaken to prepare for her visit were, and some gifts were presented. Please God you don't present us with gifts, because she wouldn't need a cart to cart them back. They were mostly vestments and things. There were formal assemblies with the students of the type that some of us would be familiar with from our school days. The local archbishop and the alumni also came to meet the Mother General. At Burke Road, she received Mother Lucy Verdon into the Society as a postulant. Lucy Verdon was the first Catholic woman to receive a science degree in Melbourne, or Victoria. And Mother Violet Dillon made her final profession, and it was at this time that Janet Stewart decided Australians could come overseas for their profession. So we are grateful to her for that. Some of the community gatherings and recreations were rather formal affairs by our standards. The community were given questions to reflect on, or an essay to write in preparation. Thank God Kathy doesn't do that to us. And of course, Janet gave a conference in each house. Thanks to the careful recording of Mother Frances Thompson, we have a complete record of the conferences that Janet gave in Australia and New Zealand houses. On one occasion, the superior of the house asked Janet if she could have her notes for the conference, and she found that they were written on the back of an envelope. And that reminded me of Janet exhorting people not to use the same notes year after year. So the records we have taken down as Janet spoke, except for the one given in Auckland, and it was evidently written from memory. Nevertheless, it gives us an important insight into Janet's thinking. This time Auckland was 5 years old. Auckland is a very young house in very young surroundings. Our religious house is very young, and our religious community still has a character and its traditions to make. It is a grave thought and well known that the character imprinted on a community by its first members is ineradicable and will go down for years and years and leave its traces on those who come after us. So it's important for us at this time of change to remember that. Earlier at Clifton, she drew inspiration from the Feast of St. Andrew the Apostle to reflect on this theme. We are called apostles and have been named apostles, and whenever we meet with the word apostle, it might give us, as one might say, spiritual curiosity to find out what the apostolic mind, the apostolic life are. And this is particularly suitable in this country, where although there are Christian traditions and Catholic life all around, yet everything is so new, and there is so much to be done to prepare unto the Lord a perfect people. There is so much training to be done, training of ourselves, training of youth, and each will share in this apostleship according to her efforts and sanctity. So the church in Australia was built by convicts. We don't have St. Columba or any of these great saints, so pretty big on the training. In reading through Janet's conferences, one gets the impression that she is sharing her experiences of a pathway that she's travelled herself. Janet's love and familiarity with scriptures shines through her talks, and she draws inspiration from the liturgical season. Speaking at Kincoppel on the Advent theme, Veni, come, she says, "Come is the most ordinary of words, and he chose it as one of his most intimate ways of calling us. It's a word of vocation. Come, follow me. In religious life, there are successive stages. Come nearer, come higher. Follow me more closely. We must be attentive, for very often that Veni is not said loudly. Come and see. Come, I will make you fishers of men." It is a word of the interior life. Come apart with me. Veni is a prayer in itself. The more we can get away from ourselves, from talking to and about ourselves, and away from elaborate formularies, the more intense is the prayer. It goes straight to God. In Melbourne, it's the Feast of the Immaculate Conception that inspires Janet to speak of Our Lady as a model of interior life. And she says that to develop in ourselves, we must have faith as the foundation and desire it. Our way to exercise our faith is by the study of the glorious truths of faith in the spirit in which Our Lady studied them. Are we as well instructed as we could be? Do we know as much as we could know? There is so much to learn. So study the truths. The study of these truths is the most glorious occupation of the mind. It is accessible to all to a certain degree. Read, think, study scripture, dogmatic works, spiritual works founded on the church, and so go on enlarging your vision of heaven. This is a splendid exercise of our faith, for nothing makes faith grow like exercise. And in speaking of desire, nothing exhausts God, his beauty, his truth, his glory. He gives his kingdom to desires, not to a slack will. Desire is a habit of the spiritual life that grows. We can quicken each other's desires by speaking of spiritual things. We can never reach the limit. That is why our life is so immense, so simple outwardly, so almost a matter of fact. In itself, absolutely nothing. Disguised. From within, so immense once we begin to love. This is a point to be specially dwelt upon. We might easily miss the greatness of its apparent simplicity. It is wonderful, the transformation that takes place when we begin to seek the kingdom of God. We do more work when preoccupied by the presence of God. We grow daily more and more than we can imagine God, and God will give it if we desire it, want it. God is more willing to give than we are to receive. The talk that Janet gave at Rose Bay serves as an elaboration of personal relationship with Jesus and deepening faith, one of the 12 elements of our life as RSCJ, listed in Life Unfolding, Offering the Gift. At Christmas, it is the sentiment of the anniversary that comes out most vividly, when he, as it were, took his first plunge into the heart of our troubles, of our difficulties, our experiences, into the heart of the life we are leading. And that, not as someone standing at a distance, but as one thrown into the stream, feeling the shock, the human astonishment of what took place around him, feeling the poverty, the pain, the isolation in which he was left. Later in this talk, she gives us a message of hope. No human soul can perfectly be understood by another. There are depths in the human heart that are the best will in the world we cannot make known to another. We have our own great solitary life with him. He knows all the joys, sorrows, trials, perplexities, all the hidden movements of our inmost life. He hears the lark and the songless egg. Within the reed, the flute notes. He sees the bud within the folded seed, and in the will, the deed. It is just the reverse of what we do. We must see the deed in order to know the will. But he sees the promise, the effort, the bud of immortal life in the failing act. That effort which was to have been so beautiful and which has come to nothing. We can't bring out the flute notes, but he hears them. We can't bring out our longing wills to do, but he is aware of it. He sees the desire folded up in the seed, the failing effort that to us is so disappointing and to others such a dismal failure, lies before him with all the pageant of its desires and will. At Timaru, she elaborates on this theme in a more practical way. In our days, the stress of work has grown, as if she knew today. It is more absorbing, more exacting than in the early days of the society, and the snare is to satisfy ourselves with work. Too much esteem of work blinds us. We must care to make our life a life of prayer, with energy given to our work from the overflow of prayer. In such a life there is balance, no fuss, no feeling of too much to do, for strength comes from prayer. Work we must, God and the society ask it, and it is beautiful, but it is not enough. We must never be satisfied short of a high understanding of the heart of our Lord, but that means the axe laid to the root. Self-love, self-seekers, self-interest have to give way. The void left will not remain empty. It will be filled with love and sympathy, and with the power to grieve with the Sacred Heart, the mysterious power to comfort him. It is 100 years Janet gave these talks. Life then for RSCJ was limited by the boundaries of enclosure, but the things that she was emphasising have enduring value for us, and we have wider scope for expressing them. She did not speak of JPIC as we do today, but we can imagine that one who so loved the beauty of the natural world would be passionate about the integrity of creation. Oceania was a missionary territory in her day, and she came to encourage those who had fulfilled Sophie's desire to make the love of Jesus known to the ends of the earth. She did not need to emphasise internationality in a vicariate that embraced 3 countries and even more nationalities in its community. And what are the echoes of Janet in ANZ today? Those of us who made our noviceship at Rose Bay received our formation and teacher training from sisters who had come under the personal influence of Janet. Hopefully, we learned from them the broad educational principles that they had absorbed. We soon learned that it was a rather sore point that no other member of the Central Council of the Society had the will to undertake the journey to our part of the world. Over the years, we have often heard sisters from other religious institutes speak with appreciation of Janet after reading her life. A few have said that if they'd read it earlier, they would have entered the society. The education of Catholic girls has even found its way onto the shelves and reading lists of our universities. As we entrusted our 4 schools to our lay colleagues, they have found in Janet's writings, guidance and principles that have enabled them to continue to educate generations of women who have demonstrated that they started out in life with energy and purpose and are making a difference to the world. Janet and Richard died in the same year, so the centenary of their deaths is like a second sounding of a gong, alerting us once more to listen to the echoes of the lives of this talented brother and sister. Both were visionaries looking to the future, but Janet had a clearer view of her telos, and that made all the difference. Now, I have one other little story, and I have to call on a companion for that. Janet, can you come forward? Is there another microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Yep. That's a tree Janet has in New Zealand, and this is some gum leaves from Australia with their blossoms. Now, Janet's got her microphone. This is on. That's it.
My mother was actually...
I've got to use it. Sorry.
Right, yeah. My mother, whose name was May Power, was at Rose Bay when Reverend Mother Stewart visited in Mum was there from 1911 to 1914. And before the Christmas holidays in 1913, they were asked to bring back from their holidays something Australian to give her. So my mother chose a copy of We of the Never Never. Some of you may have heard of, but it's now an Australian classic. It had been just written a couple of years before. And she was reading it. She travelled from Rockhampton to Sydney by ship, and that's nearly 1,000 miles. And on the way she thought she'd read the book, which she did leaning over the rail, and unfortunately a gust of wind blew it in the sea. So 100 years later, Rita suggested that I and my daughters and my granddaughters, who are all Stuart home family, bring a copy. It's not 100 years old, it's 30 years old, was the oldest I could get, to her successor, which is...
Thank you, that's very touching. I'll leave it up in the front. I think we could even unwrap it perhaps. People could look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita and Janet, for a fascinating talk about the Two Stuarts. amazing that they both died within a few months of each other. Never knew that. We're going to break now until 11 o'clock. Please be back by 11.